For decades, people wrote off Bigfoot sightings across America as nothing more than folklore and fuzzy photographs. But when cameras across the country start capturing these creatures in stunning clarity, the evidence stops being a punchline and starts being something no one can look away from. Welcome to Bigfoot Encounters. I'm Trevor. In today's episode, we reveal America's clearest Bigfoot footage ever recorded that will make you question everything you thought you knew about what's been living in these woods all along. David had worked for 11 years in Yellowstone's backcountry, and his October 15th morning started with reports from experienced backpackers near Cache Creek. They'd heard sounds that didn't match any known animal, deep whooping sounds in call and response patterns. But these were not mating calls, nor territorial warnings. It sounded like an actual language. What Krueger didn't know yet was that his body cam would soon capture proof of exactly what those sounds meant. The Cache Creek was a common Bigfoot habitat, remote enough for privacy and close enough to major trail systems to monitor human activity. If you wanted to disappear for a while, this was the perfect place. At 2:15 p.m., Krueger headed toward the area on foot. The route took him through dense pine forests and natural bottlenecks, exactly the kind of terrain where something smart could stay hidden. If there were Bigfoots here, they'd be able to watch his every step and choose exactly where any encounter would happen. Krueger didn't realize he was walking into a funnel, and his body cam was recording every step. The body cam footage from the first mile shows subtle signs that something unusual was happening. Animal activity was way below normal levels for that season and time of the day. Birds were present, but seemed nervous, with flight patterns that suggested they were deliberately avoiding certain areas of the forest. The big question was why? Why were they avoiding those areas? At 3:47 p.m., Krueger found physical evidence that switched his investigation from checking out weird reports to documenting creatures that weren't supposed to exist. He found footprints, larger than a human. Now these footprints measured 16 inches long and 8 inches wide, measurements that could only be made by something walking upright on two legs while weighing between 600 and 800 pounds. The footprints showed characteristics that were unmistakably consistent with authentic Bigfoot track evidence. 5 distinct toes with clear joint articulation, an opposable thumb arrangement that proved these creatures had hands capable of grasping and manipulating objects, and dermal ridge patterns that showed these definitely weren't fake carvings or misidentified bear prints. What made these tracks especially important was their freshness and the direction they indicated Bigfoot had been traveling. The prints were less than 12 hours old, made during the same time period when campers had reported coordinated vocalizations that suggested multiple Bigfoots were operating as a team in the immediate area. The tracks headed directly toward dense forest cover where intelligent creatures could watch human activity while staying completely hidden. Krueger spent 20 minutes carefully documenting every detail of the footprints, taking measurements and filming them from multiple angles. His body cam captured detailed footage that would later prove crucial when specialists analyzed it. The trail of footprints led directly into elevated terrain. Krueger followed the tracks for about half a mile before losing them on rocky ground that wouldn't hold impressions, but the direction was unmistakable. Whatever had made those prints was moving toward elevated positions that would provide excellent observation points for monitoring human activity in the valley below. The body cam timestamp shows 4:03 p.m. when Krueger made a discovery that revealed just how sophisticated Bigfoot's behavior really was. He found additional footprints that weren't following the same route as the previous tracks, but were paralleling his own path with disturbing precision. These newer tracks stayed about 40 yards to his right, matching his speed and direction perfectly while maintaining distance that kept the Bigfoot just outside normal human detection range. This was absolutely terrifying when you really thought about what it meant. Bigfoot wasn't just randomly traveling through the same area where Krueger happened to be hiking. It was deliberately following him, studying how he moved, staying at surveillance distance that allowed the creature to observe human behavior while remaining completely hidden. The parallel tracks showed that Bigfoot deliberately stepped in locations that minimized ground disturbance and reduced the risk of leaving obvious signs that might alert its human target to the surveillance operation. This level of tactical sophistication demonstrated that these creatures understood human tracking techniques and could counter standard methods used to detect wildlife in forests. On the audio, you could hear it. The woods had gone quiet. At 4:12 p.m., the Bigfoot that had been stalking Krueger revealed itself through vocalizations that demonstrated the sophisticated communication capabilities that made these creatures so remarkable and dangerous. The first call came from the forest to Krueger's right, exactly where the parallel tracks suggested his pursuer was positioned. The vocalization was unlike anything in standard wildlife biology, combining incredible depth and complexity that proved it was intentional communication rather than an instinctive animal response. The sound lasted about 6 seconds. You can hear it clearly on the recording, harmonic variations that suggest actual language capability. 3 minutes later, the vocalization was repeated from a completely different location, proving the creature had moved while maintaining perfect surveillance of Krueger's position. Then a third call came from Krueger's left side, revealing that multiple Bigfoots were now involved in what appeared to be a coordinated operation designed to surround him and control his movement options. These creatures were talking to each other while positioning themselves tactically to maximize their advantage in whatever confrontation they were planning. The Bigfoot calls continued at irregular intervals as the creatures maneuvered through the forest around Krueger's position. The body cam audio picks up each call clearly, immediately answered by others, creating a communication network that allowed real-time coordination of their positioning and adjustments based on how Krueger was moving. At 4:19 p.m., Krueger entered a small clearing where the afternoon sunlight provided perfect conditions for what would become the most detailed visual documentation of Bigfoot appearance and behavior ever recorded. And then, the camera finally captures it in full view. The lead Bigfoot stood about 60 yards ahead, positioned beside a fallen tree, where it had apparently been doing some kind of foraging while maintaining observation of the approaching human. This Bigfoot was absolutely massive, beyond anything Krueger could have imagined possible for any North American creature. Standing fully upright, it was at least 7.5 feet tall, with a body structure that combined human-like proportions with muscle mass that exceeded anything in known animal anatomy. The shoulders were incredibly broad, supporting arms that hung past where the knees would be on a human, ending in hands that showed remarkable size and obvious dexterity. The creature was covered in dark brown hair that hung in thick clumps over visible muscle definition, dense, well-maintained, not the messy coat people usually described. The head combined human and ape features, cone-shaped skull with a pronounced sagittal crest. The face showed intelligence despite features clearly adapted for a different evolutionary path. The eyes were positioned forward like a predator's. They showed awareness, conscious thought, not instinct. Bigfoot was thinking. For 8 seconds, Krueger watched it forage near the log. The hands manipulated decaying wood with precision, searching for grubs or protein, purposeful, deliberate movements. The body cam captures the exact moment. The Bigfoot turned and made direct eye contact. The eyes were positioned forward like a predator's, locked directly on Krueger with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. They showed awareness, conscious thought, not instinct. The creature wasn't reacting on autopilot like an animal caught off guard. The Bigfoot was thinking, processing, and evaluating the human standing in front of it. Those eyes held calculation and intent that went far beyond anything you'd see in even the most intelligent animals. The moment lasted 2 seconds. Krueger saw it happen in real time. Recognition, assessment, decision. The creature's expression shifted from evaluation to aggression. Lips pulled back, revealing teeth designed for meat, a clear threat display. The roar, captured on audio so clearly you can feel it, was unlike anything in documented wildlife. And the message was unmistakable: leave now or die. Krueger ran. Behind him, the creature didn't panic. It moved with controlled aggression, completely confident it could end the chase whenever it wanted. The Bigfoot covered ground with enormous strides, maintaining perfect balance even on difficult terrain. Each step covered what would take Krueger 3 or 4. You could hear controlled breathing aside from Krueger's tedious breathing, much different from his that was so clear in the audio, but a steady, effortless rhythm. The creature wasn't even trying. It was controlling the chase. During the chase, Krueger heard his pursuer making shorter calls that were immediately answered from other locations throughout the forest. Bigfoot was communicating with the others, coordinating positions, sharing information about his movements and potential escape routes. The forest erupted with answering calls from multiple directions. Krueger wasn't being chased by a single creature, but by a coordinated group positioned to cut off every escape route. The Bigfoot family worked together with tactical sophistication, controlling his movements to ensure the outcome they wanted. 90 seconds in, it became clear that the lead Bigfoot was controlling the distance rather than pursuing at full speed. The sounds would surge closer. Krueger could hear its breathing, its footsteps, then fall back, maintaining psychological pressure without overtaking him. This wasn't normal predatory behavior. This was psychological warfare conducted by something intelligent enough to understand the terror value of controlled intimidation. The pursuit behavior demonstrated intelligence and tactical thinking that went beyond what anyone expected. These beings understood human psychology well enough to maximize fear while maintaining complete control over the encounter. At 4:20 p.m., the psychological intimidation ended. Krueger stumbled over an exposed root and crashed to the forest floor. His body cam recorded the impact and the terrifying speed with which the creature closed the final distance. Before Krueger could even attempt to get up, Bigfoot was on top of him. The camera shakes violently as a massive hand grabbed Krueger's shoulder and flipped him from face down to face up with casual effort that revealed how completely outmatched human strength was against Bigfoot power. The creature could have caused devastating injury, but was choosing to demonstrate dominance instead. Up close, the Bigfoot was even more incredible and terrifying than it had appeared from a distance. The facial features showed unmistakable intelligence despite anatomical adaptations for a completely different evolutionary pathway. The eyes held awareness and evaluation, conscious thought, not instinct. The creature was studying Krueger with what looked like scientific curiosity, while simultaneously asserting physical dominance, leaving no doubt about who controlled the encounter. The creature's breath carried the smell of meat and organic matter, a diet completely outside human experience. When it opened its mouth, the teeth were adapted for crushing and tearing with strength far beyond human capability, designed for prey that would challenge even the largest known predators. When Krueger tried to draw his sidearm, the creature's response made human defenses completely useless. One casual swipe sent the weapon spinning into the underbrush with enough force to bend the metal frame. The movement was so fast that Krueger's eyes couldn't even track it. Bigfoot grabbed both of Krueger's legs and began dragging him across the forest floor. Krueger tried to slow himself by clawing at the ground, but his efforts were useless against the strength that treated his body weight as negligible. After about 20 feet, the creature stopped and positioned itself directly over him in a dominance display that left no doubt about the power hierarchy. This was the moment Krueger was certain he was about to die. Everything about the encounter had demonstrated that human technology, training, and physical capability were meaningless against creatures that combined apex predator strength with intelligence that approached or exceeded human strategic thinking. There was no reasonable expectation he would survive whatever came next. But instead of attacking, the creature released a shorter, sharper vocalization. The body cam catches it all. Within seconds, 2 additional Bigfoots emerged from concealed positions in the surrounding forest. Krueger had been completely surrounded throughout the entire encounter. The coordination required for this positioning demonstrated tactical planning and operational discipline that exceeded anything in known animal social structures. The second Bigfoot was slightly smaller than the first, possibly female, with similar dark brown coloring but less pronounced muscular development and a smaller sagittal ridge that might indicate sexual dimorphism. The third was clearly a juvenile, approximately 4 feet tall, but already showing the robust build that would eventually make it as formidable as the adults. This was a family unit with protective motivations and social bonds that would influence how they managed human contact. The three creatures positioned themselves around Krueger in a triangular formation, demonstrating coordinated tactical thinking. Their positioning prevented escape in any direction, while allowing each creature to maintain visual contact with the others for continued communication. The formation was precisely calculated to maximize control while minimizing the possibility that Krueger could create unexpected complications. The communication between the three Bigfoots was remarkably complex. The vocalizations were subtle and controlled, suggesting language capability that allowed detailed coordination without creating noise that might attract other humans. The creatures were clearly discussing Krueger, his status, his equipment, their intentions for how this would end. All three showed intense interest in Krueger's technology and equipment. The footage shows the juvenile leaning in close, its face filling the frame as it examines the body cam itself with obvious curiosity. Carefully examining his uniform, radio, and body cam with obvious curiosity about human capabilities. The footage also shows the possible female studying his boots and clothing with attention that suggested she was documenting human appearance and equipment for future reference. Their behavior indicated they understood that human technology represented capabilities that could affect future encounters, and that gathering intelligence about it was strategically important for their own security and avoiding detection. Their curiosity was scientific rather than casual. These beings understood cause and effect and were actively learning about human capabilities that might impact their survival and territorial control. The examination continued for approximately 5 minutes as the creatures communicated in their vocal language about whatever conclusions they were drawing about human technology and Krueger's role as a ranger. Their discussion was clearly detailed and analytical, suggesting cognitive capabilities that allowed complex information processing and strategic decision-making about the long-term implications of human contact. The adult male made a final vocalization that seemed to conclude their analysis and communicate their decision. The message was unmistakable, conveyed through posture, vocal tone, and direct eye contact, transcending language and conveying a crystal-clear meaning about territorial ownership and human status within their territory. The message was simple and clear. This territory belongs to us. You exist here only because we allow it. Leave now and do not return, or the next encounter will end differently. The three Bigfoots turned and walked back into the forest, moving silently despite their massive size and the dense undergrowth. Their departure was as controlled and tactical as their approach, demonstrating stealth capabilities that would make them nearly impossible to track unless they chose to reveal themselves. Within seconds, they had vanished completely into terrain that offered limited concealment, proving their knowledge of the environment and movement skills were far superior to anything human tracking could match. Krueger remained motionless on the ground for a full minute after the creatures disappeared, too stunned to process the implications of surviving an encounter that should have ended with his death. Everything about the interaction had demonstrated that these creatures possessed intelligence, tactical capability, and physical dominance that made them the true controllers of wilderness territory humans believed they managed. The Bigfoot family's behavior revealed social structure, communication capabilities, and strategic thinking that challenged every assumption about what kinds of intelligent life existed in North America's wilderness. Their coordination, restraint, and territorial messaging indicated these creatures were far more than the primitive forest dwellers most people imagined. They were intelligent beings with sophisticated understanding of human behavior and the strategic implications of contact between species. Most remarkably, The creatures had chosen to demonstrate their dominance without killing, suggesting decision-making that included consideration of long-term consequences and strategic thinking about human Bigfoot relationships beyond immediate territorial defense. Their message had been delivered with precision that ensured understanding while avoiding escalation that might attract unwanted attention from authorities or military response. The body cam footage of this entire encounter would provide unprecedented documentation of Bigfoot intelligence, behavior, and capabilities that challenged everything mainstream science believed about primate evolution and cognitive development. The 3 hours and 43 minutes of high-definition video and audio represented the most comprehensive evidence ever recorded of creatures whose existence had implications extending into questions of national security and human dominance over North American wilderness. The footage documented creatures that possessed tactical coordination, sophisticated communication, advanced problem-solving, and social structure, indicating intelligence approaching or potentially exceeding human cognitive capability in wilderness survival and territorial management. Most significantly, it provided evidence that these beings had been studying human behavior for extended periods, learning operational protocols, and developing strategic approaches to contact that allowed them to maintain complete control over when and how encounters occurred. What made this footage remarkable was how it revealed Bigfoot intelligence operating on multiple levels simultaneously. These creatures were conducting surveillance, coordinating family activities, assessing human technology, making tactical decisions about threats, and communicating complex information between individuals, all while managing a contact situation that required split-second adjustments. The family demonstrated understanding of human psychology that allowed them to maximize intimidation while controlling escalation, knowledge of forest ecosystems that gave them complete tactical advantage, and decision-making that weighed long-term strategic considerations against immediate territorial defense. These were not primitive creatures responding to instinct. These were intelligent beings making calculated decisions about how to manage their relationship with a species they recognized as technologically advanced but physically inferior. Ranger David Krueger's body cam footage proves that North America's wilderness areas are home to creatures whose intelligence and capabilities pose a fundamental challenge to human assumptions about which species actually control these environments and what kinds of encounters might be possible when humans venture into territory these beings consider their own. The implications extend beyond proving Bigfoots exist. It demonstrates that these creatures have successfully managed human contact for decades or centuries, revealing themselves only when it serves their objectives, while maintaining security that has kept their true capabilities hidden from scientific investigation.
Oh, there he goes.
After debunking decades of Sasquatch claims, David Paulides finally reveals the most convincing Bigfoot footage ever. Frame by frame, he found himself confronting evidence so impossible that it would force authorities to expose what they've been hiding. David's investigation began in Northern California, in areas where Bigfoot sightings had been reported for generations. Rather than chasing fresh reports or setting up cameras hoping to capture footage, the approach was methodical. Interview witnesses, gather physical evidence, look for patterns, apply the same investigative techniques used in criminal cases to a mystery that had frustrated researchers for decades. Could the truth be found not in proving existence, but in understanding nature? What emerged from thousands of interviews and field investigations was a picture far more complex than anyone anticipated. The physical evidence was there, plenty of it, but alongside all that tangible proof were reports of phenomena that didn't fit any known biological model. Creatures that seemed to vanish in open terrain, encounters accompanied by strange lights and unexplainable sensations, behavior that suggested intelligence far beyond what an undiscovered primate should possess. Footprints discovered across North America, from California to Washington, from Minnesota to Oklahoma, show consistent anatomical features that appear in casts taken by different people in different decades. These aren't crude impressions that could be carved out of wood and stamped in mud. They show dermal ridges, the equivalent of fingerprints on the soles of feet. They demonstrate a mid-tarsal break, a flexibility in the middle of the foot that humans don't possess, but that would be biomechanically advantageous for a heavy creature moving through rough terrain. Forensic podiatrists who've examined these casts can't explain them away as hoaxes. The complexity is simply too great, creating fake dermal ridges that follow anatomically correct patterns that appear slightly different in each print, the way real fingerprints vary, that show pressure variations consistent with weight distribution during walking. That level of sophisticated forgery would be nearly impossible. And for what purpose? Most of these prints are found in remote locations where no one would see them unless specifically searching. Paul Freeman, a ranger working in the middle of nowhere by himself, stumbled across unusual tracks that started and stopped sometimes in the middle of nowhere. He carried his camera around, hoping to catch something, though he wasn't even sure what. And this is where one of the most famous footage was caught, when he finally captured video evidence of a Bigfoot-like creature, complete with a child being picked up at the end. The world dismissed it. Yet the footage came from an era before digitalization, when such manipulation was effectively impossible. Freeman wasn't a wealthy man. He couldn't have hoaxed it. How could such evidence simply be ignored? Aside from visuals, the vocalizations are equally compelling. Audio recordings from the Sierra Nevada mountains, captured in the 1970s by Ron Moorhead and his companions, have been analyzed by sound engineers and linguistics experts. These recordings, known as the Sierra sounds, aren't recordings of known animals. They're not humans attempting to hoax. The frequency ranges exceed what human vocal cords can produce. The patterns show structure that suggests language, actual communication with grammar and meaning. Then there's the physical evidence of strength. Massive trees found broken or twisted at heights 10 to 15 feet off the ground in ways that don't match wind or ice damage. Boulders moved that would require multiple people or machinery. Structures built from logs that would take teams of men to manipulate. Whatever is creating these effects possesses strength far beyond human capability. Could this be dismissed as natural phenomena? Here's where things become complicated. For every piece of solid, measurable evidence, there's a report that makes no biological sense. And these aren't rare anomalies that can be dismissed as mistakes or misidentifications. They're consistent patterns that appear again and again in witness testimony from credible observers who have nothing to gain from fabricating stories. According to Paulides, park rangers, people who work in the wilderness every day, who understand sightlines and terrain, who know what animals can and can't do, describe encounters where massive creatures vanish between trees in terrain where there's nowhere to hide. The being is visible one moment, impossible to miss given its size, and simply gone the next. Not running away, not ducking behind cover, just no longer there. These are trained observers reporting something that shouldn't be possible. Barb Choupet's footage captured in her own backyard showed similar impossibilities. She heard something walking on the gravel and noticed her dogs crying under the porch. What caught her attention next defied explanation. She could hear the screen door open, saw the doorknob turning. What she was looking at was covered entirely in hair. The smell was overwhelming, like a dead animal. When investigators examined the area, they found a 17-inch track in the creek bed nearby, right where she'd indicated. The footage she captured matched patterns seen in Scott Carpenter's research, validating one account with another. But what was most disturbing wasn't what was captured on film, but what happened after. The sense that these beings choose when to appear and when to vanish. Now it's easy to dismiss footage as hoax, but what if researchers chimed in with their DNA expertise? Over the course of several years, David Paulides and his team collected samples alleged to be from these creatures for genetic testing. Hair that didn't match known species, biological material from sites where encounters occurred, anything that might provide definitive proof of what these beings actually are. Finding a laboratory willing to test the samples proved nearly impossible. UC Davis, UC Berkeley, all the major labs refused to touch it when they discovered it was Bigfoot related. The only person willing to conduct the analysis was Dr. Melba Ketchum, a geneticist who had testified in Texas courts and put people on death row based on her DNA testimony. When people questioned her expertise, Paulides had a simple challenge: find a bigger expert who can testify in court. They wouldn't find one. When the DNA analysis came back, it showed something nobody expected. The mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited only from the mother, came back completely human. Not similar to human, not close to human, but identical to modern human mitochondrial DNA. Genetic markers suggested this maternal lineage originated in the Middle East approximately 12 to 15,000 years ago, the same genetic heritage that can be traced in human populations today. But the nuclear DNA, which is inherited from both parents, told a different story. The sequences didn't match anything in genetic databases. Not human, not any known primate, not any cataloged species. The analysis suggested the presence of DNA from an unknown source, something that should theoretically be impossible. Every creature on Earth has ancestors. Every species has evolutionary relatives. Finding DNA that doesn't match any known organism in 34 trillion base pairs in GenBank raises profound questions. Mainstream geneticists argued contamination, suggesting that human DNA got mixed into samples during collection or testing. They pointed to methodological concerns and the fact that the study wasn't published in major peer-reviewed journals. For many scientists, the results were interesting but ultimately inconclusive, more likely to reflect problems with the testing process than evidence of an unknown species. But Paulides interpreted the data differently. If the maternal line is human, but the paternal line is something unknown, what does that imply? The hypothesis suggested that these creatures might represent a hybrid, the result of an unknown hominid species interbreeding with humans thousands of years ago. It would explain their human-like appearance, their obvious intelligence, and their ability to remain hidden despite being so large and apparently widespread. Critics claimed the DNA was contaminated, but Paulides had a simple response to this argument. Let's pretend contamination occurred in the worst possible way. Let's pretend someone grabbed the hair sample, rolled it between their hands, rubbed it on their face, and contaminated it thoroughly. The lab would still cleanse it, and even if contamination remained, what would the testing reveal? On the maternal side, you'd find the contaminator's mother's DNA. On the fraternal side, you'd find the contaminator's father's DNA. To find nothing on the fraternal side, to find DNA that matches nothing in any database, is literally impossible through contamination. That's never happened before. When researcher L.A. Marzulli studied elongated skulls in South America and conducted DNA testing, he encountered the same phenomenon, unknown nuclear DNA. He knew it. He had been saying from day one that when nuclear DNA was found, there'd be nothing in the GenBank to match it. The maternal DNA traced to the Middle East raised even more eyebrows, particularly among those familiar with religious texts. Could these beings somehow be connected to ancient accounts? Could they be what old texts referred to as the Nephilim, the giants that once walked the earth? Scott Carpenter, a researcher who worked closely with Paulides, believed they were. He called them the beasts of the earth, referenced in ancient traditions, and the DNA evidence seemed to support historical accounts of giants whose bones were supposedly collected by museums like the Smithsonian, bones that today the Smithsonian claims never existed. This presents a fundamental challenge to the ape hypothesis. Gorillas are intelligent. Chimpanzees use tools and have complex social structures. Orangutans demonstrate problem-solving abilities that rival human children, but no ape developed spoken language in the wild. The cognitive architecture required for language, the specific neural pathways and brain structures, evolved in humans and our direct ancestors. If these creatures possess genuine language, they're not just unusually smart animals. They're something fundamentally different from any known primate. The behavior demonstrates strategic intelligence applied to avoiding detection. These beings understand human technology. They avoid trail cameras with remarkable consistency. They stay out of clear lines of sight. They seem to understand when they're being observed or tracked. This isn't animal cunning. This is intelligence comparable to, or possibly exceeding human intelligence, deployed specifically to remain hidden. One wildlife biologist conducting field research observed behavior that stunned him. He was watching a clear-cut area through binoculars, observing a massive figure crossing approximately 200 yards away. The figure stood well over 7 feet tall and moved with a distinctive gait. He had a clear view for several seconds. He blinked, adjusted his grip on the binoculars, and when he looked again, the figure had vanished. The clear cut stretched for a quarter mile in every direction, with nowhere to hide. Whatever he'd been watching had disappeared from open ground in the span of a second. The sensation of being watched is almost universal in encounter reports. Not the vague unease of being in dark woods, but an overwhelming, focused awareness that something intelligent is observing. People describe it as feeling eyes on them, a physical sensation that makes neck hair stand up and triggers every primitive warning system humans possess. But when they turn to look, there's nothing visible, just that persistent sense of being studied by something hidden, something patient, something that chooses when and whether to reveal itself. Multiple hunters report experiencing what they describe as time distortions during encounters. A hunter tracking a deer saw a large figure ahead and froze, trying to decide whether to retreat or investigate. From his perspective, he stood there for perhaps 10 seconds before backing away, slowly. But when he checked his watch later, he'd lost 45 minutes. He has no memory of that time, no sense of anything unusual happening, just a gap where time should have been. Other hunters report similar experiences, losing anywhere from minutes to hours with no recollection of what occurred. During the filming of one documentary, the videographer and sound technician, experienced professionals who'd worked countless shoots, were absolutely stunned when 3 cameras went down simultaneously and 3 different lavalier microphones failed at the same time. They said that they've heard about this, but they can't believe they experienced it. It goes toward the evidence that in areas where Bigfoot is present, electronics behave impossibly. In one interview captured in the film, a paramedic described encountering a Bigfoot that crossed in front of their emergency vehicle, and everything in their rig shut down, every piece of electronic equipment going dark simultaneously. These people are credible professionals reporting something that defies conventional understanding. Over time, Paulides finally started listening to Native American accounts, and a very different picture emerged. Tribal elders don't speak of these beings as animals. They describe them as people, another tribe that lives according to different rules. The indigenous languages have specific names for them, not the generic Bigfoot coined by modern society, but terms that translate more closely to old people, or forest people, or the tall ones. Without the advancements of cameras, traditions passed down through generations, the knowledge that these beings have language, culture, social structures, and laws. They live in family groups, care for their young, and maintain territories. Some tribal accounts describe them as the original inhabitants, the first people who lived on the land before modern humans arrived. Other traditions say they came from the stars, descending to Earth in ancient times and choosing to live in deep forests away from human civilization. The descriptions consistently emphasize human-like qualities rather than animal characteristics. They're intelligent and aware, capable of choosing when and how to interact with people. Some tribes describe them as generally peaceful but protective of their territories, avoiding humans when possible but capable of asserting themselves when necessary. The protocols for encountering them involve respect and appropriate behavior, treating them as one would treat people from another culture, not as wild animals to be feared or hunted. Historical records support these accounts. Journals and letters from settlers in the 1800s include references to indigenous people speaking of hairy giants in the mountains. One particularly detailed account from a rancher in Northern California describes Native Americans bringing food to a creature living in nearby cliffs, treating it with respect and care. The rancher asked elders about it and was told the creature was a kind of person, different from them, but deserving of consideration and protection. These tribal perspectives align with evidence that modern investigators find puzzling. If the creatures possess language, if they demonstrate intelligence and cultural behaviors, if they're capable of complex decision-making and social organization, then treating them as undiscovered apes fundamentally misunderstands what they are. The indigenous communities have been saying this for centuries. Perhaps it's time researchers started taking that knowledge seriously. Over the years, Freedom of Information requests and interviews with former government personnel have revealed something disturbing. Official agencies, from the National Park Service to the Forest Service to military installations, have documented encounters but never made them public. Reports exist in archives that the general public doesn't access. Rangers have been told to redirect questions about unusual sightings. Military personnel stationed in remote areas have been debriefed about encounters and instructed not to discuss them. One document Paulides obtained through persistent requests describes an incident at a secure facility in the Pacific Northwest. Multiple personnel reported seeing a large bipedal figure moving along the perimeter fence. Security footage captured something, but was classified and removed from standard records. The official explanation was that nothing unusual occurred, but employees who were present insist otherwise, describing a creature that stood at least 8 feet tall and moved with obvious intelligence, studying the facility's layout as if assessing defenses. Why would government agencies suppress or downplay these encounters? Several theories exist. Perhaps they genuinely don't know what the creatures are and don't want to create public panic about an unexplained phenomenon. Maybe they're concerned about the impact on public lands if people became afraid to visit national parks and forests. Or possibly they know more than they're admitting, and disclosure would raise questions about why information has been withheld for decades. Former personnel occasionally speak out after retirement, describing encounters during their service and the official responses. The pattern is consistent. Acknowledge the event internally, document it, and then minimize or deny it in any public forum. This isn't conspiracy theory speculation. These are documented cases with paper trails and multiple witnesses. Something is being observed in government-controlled areas, and the official position remains that nothing unusual is happening. The disconnect between private knowledge and public statements raises obvious questions. Jonathan Dover, a Navajo ranger, provided perhaps the most credible insider perspective, according to Paulides. During his time with the Rangers, his primary job at some point became investigating Bigfoot and UFOs. He came across as such a credible individual that it's hard not to believe everything he says. He even worked at Skinwalker Ranch, where he brought drummers with him during one investigation. They were watching boulders at a distance, and those drums heated up the boulders in a way that made no rational sense. It was a turning point that made researchers think that maybe sound, maybe rhythm, maybe there's something to all this that needed further investigation. Among the most perplexing patterns in encounter reports are descriptions of unusual lights. Witnesses describe seeing orbs or spheres of light in areas where encounters occur, sometimes before seeing a creature, sometimes during an encounter, sometimes after. These aren't distant lights that could be explained as aircraft or astronomical objects. They're described as glowing spheres at ground level or floating through trees, moving in ways that seem purposeful and controlled. Paulides noted that one researcher captured video footage showing a brief flash of reddish light that coincided exactly with a deep grunting vocalization. The light appeared and disappeared in a fraction of a second, but frame-by-frame analysis showed it corresponded precisely with the sound. Every attempt to explain it as lens flare or passing insects failed. The color, intensity, and timing didn't match any conventional explanation. It remained a mystery, one more piece of evidence that didn't fit expected patterns. Other reports describe larger light phenomena. Witnesses talk about shimmering areas that look like heat distortion or the visual effect when looking through water. These distortions appear in forest clearings or along tree lines, with figures sometimes visible within or emerging from them. Some witnesses describe the distortions as looking like doorways or windows, rectangular areas where the air itself seems different. Creatures are reported stepping through these areas and vanishing, or appearing from them as if entering from somewhere else. At locations known for unusual activity, certain areas of Native American reservations or specific wilderness regions, witnesses report seeing both creatures and light phenomena occurring together. Videos exist showing thermal signatures of large bipedal figures in proximity to unexplained light sources. Are these separate mysteries happening in the same locations by coincidence? Or is there an actual connection? Could these creatures somehow be associated with, or even traveling through, the light phenomena that witnesses describe? After years of accumulating evidence, after thousands of interviews and countless hours analyzing reports, Paulides identified a pattern that traditional researchers had been ignoring. In a significant number of encounters, witnesses describe seeing creatures appear or disappear in ways that suggest they're not simply moving through normal space. They seem to be stepping into or out of areas where the air looks different, where reality itself appears distorted. One account from a rancher describes watching through binoculars as a large figure walked toward a shimmering area in a meadow. The shimmer looked like heat distortion, but the day was cool and overcast. The figure appeared to pause at the edge of this distortion, then stepped into it and vanished. Not walked behind something, not moved out of sight, but disappeared as if stepping through a doorway into somewhere else. The rancher watched the area for another 20 minutes. The shimmer remained visible for a few minutes and then faded away. This theory explains several persistent mysteries. How do creatures weighing hundreds of pounds move through forests without leaving tracks? They don't always move through normal space. Why do footprint trails begin and end impossibly? Because the creatures aren't walking the entire distance. How do they disappear from open terrain where there's nowhere to hide? They're not hiding. They're leaving through means that don't involve normal movement. One of the most consistently reported and most troubling patterns involves footprints that begin or end impossibly. A couple hiking in national parkland discovered a set of massive tracks crossing a snow-covered meadow. The prints were clear and deep, showing the weight of whatever made them. They followed the trail, photographing the tracks, measuring the stride length. The prints continued across the meadow in a straight line, and then simply stopped. No final print showing a jump or leap. No disturbance suggesting the creature climbed a tree. The tracks just ended in the middle of open snow with no explanation. Rangers in multiple states report similar discoveries. Tracks that appear in the middle of fields or clearings with no trail leading to the first print. Footprints that show up in fresh snow on Forest Service roads, continuing for 50 or 100 yards, and then terminating without explanation. In some cases, the prints end at the base of a tree, but inspection shows no bark disturbance, no scratches or marks suggesting anything climbed up. The tracks simply stop, as if whatever made them ceased to exist at that point. Even more disturbing are reports of tracks that seem to disappear while being followed. A researcher tracking prints through fresh snow described seeing them clearly ahead, following carefully to preserve the evidence. When looking down at the trail already covered, the prints behind were fading, becoming shallower and less distinct, eventually disappearing entirely. Another investigator reported photographing a clear footprint, marking its location, and returning hours later to find the print gone, not filled in by wind or weather, but smoothed over as if it had never existed. However, when discussing the most convincing Bigfoot footage in history, Paulides said that one film still stands above all others: the Patterson-Gimlin footage from 1967 at Bluff Creek, California, as cliché as it may sound. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, two old rodeo cowboys, captured something on film that has never been debunked despite decades of scrutiny. The subject moves naturally, with muscle and limb movement inconsistent with human anatomy. The stride length exceeds human norms. The behavior suggests awareness and intelligence. The footage shows what appears to be a female Bigfoot, nicknamed Patty, walking across a creek bed. When she turns to look at the camera, the moment is remarkable. The being is aware she's being filmed. She makes a choice to look, to acknowledge the observers, and then to continue on her way. The musculature visible in the film, the way the muscles move beneath the hair, the proportions of the limbs. Forensic analysis has confirmed these details are consistent with a real creature, not a person in a suit. Paul Freeman's footage from the 1990s shows remarkable similarities. The gleam that comes off the creature in Freeman's film matches the gleam coming off Patty in the Patterson-Gimlin footage. Freeman captured something that, if it had emerged today in the age of digital manipulation, would be immediately dismissed. But because it happened before digitalization, there's no way it was faked using modern techniques. The footage even shows a child being picked up by Bigfoot at the end, a detail Freeman didn't even notice at the time. These pieces of film footage, combined with the physical evidence, the DNA results, the witness testimony, and the anomalous phenomena, create a picture that's impossible to ignore. Something is out there, something real. But what the footage really captures isn't just a creature. It's evidence of a phenomenon that exists at the boundaries of current understanding. After nearly 2 decades of investigation, thousands of interviews, analysis of physical evidence from across North America, and careful consideration of reports that seemed impossible, David Paulides reached conclusions on these footages that make many people uncomfortable. Bigfoot is real, not probably real, not possibly real, but definitely real based on the accumulated weight of evidence. But understanding what Bigfoot actually is requires setting aside simple explanations and confronting a phenomenon that's far stranger than most researchers want to acknowledge. The investigation continues. More footage evidence emerges every year. More witnesses come forward with experiences that follow the same patterns. More researchers take the phenomenon seriously and contribute their expertise to understanding it. Slowly, gradually, the picture becomes clearer. Not clear enough yet for definitive answers, but clear enough to know that something real, something intelligent, something that exists at the edge of human understanding is out there. David Kellerman had built his reputation on finding things that others couldn't or wouldn't. After 15 years in military intelligence, specializing in reconnaissance and surveillance operations, he had transitioned to private investigation work that often took him to places most people would never dare to venture. During his service, David had developed skills that few civilians possessed. He could move through any terrain without leaving traces, set up surveillance equipment that would remain undetected for months, and analyze behavioral patterns with an accuracy that had made him legendary among his peers. The case that brought David to the Humboldt County wilderness seemed straightforward enough. Margaret Thornfield, an elderly widow from San Francisco, had hired him to investigate the disappearance of her grandson, 22-year-old Timothy Thornfield, who had vanished during a solo camping trip 6 months earlier. The official search had been called off after 3 weeks, with authorities concluding that Timothy had likely fallen victim to harsh wilderness conditions. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with the official explanation. Timothy had been an experienced outdoorsman and Eagle Scout who knew the forests of Northern California better than most park rangers. She was convinced that something else had happened to her grandson. The official investigation had been thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Search and rescue teams had combed hundreds of square miles of forest using helicopters, tracking dogs, and thermal imaging equipment. They had found Timothy's abandoned campsite relatively quickly, but the scene had raised more questions than answers. His tent was still standing, his food supplies were untouched, and his expensive camera equipment was scattered around the site as if he had left in a hurry. David's investigation had led him deep into the Six Rivers National Forest, following Timothy's planned route through some of the most remote terrain in California. His methodical approach had already uncovered several clues that suggested Timothy's disappearance was far from ordinary. Strange footprints around the abandoned campsite, unusual hair samples caught on tree branches, and several damaged trees that showed signs of being deliberately broken. The footprints were unlike anything David had encountered. They measured approximately 16 inches in length and 8 inches in width, with a depth that suggested something weighing at least 400 pounds. The stride pattern indicated bipedal movement, but the gait was different from human locomotion. It was on his 4th day in the forest that David made the discovery that would change everything. While investigating a remote valley about 2 miles from Timothy's last known location, David's motion-activated trail cameras had captured something extraordinary during the previous night. The footage showed a massive, bipedal creature moving through the forest with purposeful intelligence, carrying what appeared to be human belongings. David's military training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but reviewing the footage on his camera's LCD screen made his hands shake with excitement and disbelief. The creature was unlike anything he had seen in his years of wilderness operations around the world. Standing at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark, coarse hair, it moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. The creature's movement patterns were particularly fascinating to David's trained eye. It demonstrated an understanding of forest navigation that surpassed even the most experienced human woodsman. The being moved along natural corridors through the dense vegetation, avoiding areas where its passage would leave obvious signs, and seemed to understand how to use terrain features to remain concealed from potential observers. More disturbing was what the creature was carrying. David could clearly make out a backpack, camping gear, and what looked like camera equipment, items that matched the description of Timothy Thornfield's missing belongings. The implications were staggering. Not only had David potentially captured the first clear footage of a Bigfoot, but the creature appeared to be connected to Timothy's disappearance. David's investigation took on new urgency as he realized he might be dealing with something far more significant than a simple missing person case. He began setting up additional cameras throughout the valley, creating a surveillance network that would monitor the creature's movements and hopefully lead him to answers about Timothy's fate. The surveillance network David established was based on techniques he had learned during counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan. He positioned cameras at natural choke points where any large creature would be forced to pass, used camouflaged solar panels to ensure continuous power, and established overlapping fields of view that would make it impossible for anything to move through the area undetected. The breakthrough came on his 6th night in the forest. David's cameras captured not just one creature, but an entire family group, adults and what appeared to be juveniles, moving through the valley in a coordinated pattern. The footage revealed behavior that was unmistakably intelligent. The creatures communicated through complex vocalizations, used tools to manipulate their environment, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that challenged everything science thought it knew about unknown primates. The family group consisted of what appeared to be 2 adult males, 3 adult females, and 4 juveniles of varying ages. Their social interactions were remarkably sophisticated, with clear hierarchies and role assignments. The larger male seemed to serve as a scout, moving ahead of the group to assess potential threats or obstacles. The females appeared to be responsible for the care and education of the juveniles, while the second male brought up the rear, ensuring the group's security. Most remarkably, the cameras captured the creatures interacting with human artifacts in ways that suggested they understood their purpose and origin. They examined Timothy's camping equipment with obvious curiosity, handled his camera gear with surprising gentleness, and even appeared to be attempting to operate some of the electronic devices. David realized he was documenting something unprecedented. Not just evidence of Bigfoot's existence, but proof that these creatures possessed intelligence and curiosity about human technology. The footage showed them living in sophisticated shelters constructed from natural materials, using primitive tools, and maintaining what appeared to be a complex social structure. The shelters were particularly impressive, demonstrating engineering principles that rivaled human construction techniques. The creatures had woven branches and vegetation into waterproof structures that provided protection from the elements while remaining virtually invisible to casual observation. The interiors were organized with designated areas for sleeping, food storage, and what appeared to be tool-making activities. But the most shocking discovery came when David's cameras captured footage of Timothy Thornfield himself, alive, apparently unharmed, and living among the creatures. The young man appeared to have been adopted into their group, participating in their daily activities and showing no signs of distress or captivity. The footage suggested that rather than being a victim, Timothy had become an observer and perhaps even a student of these remarkable beings. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Timothy appeared to have been living with the creatures for months, learning their behaviors and possibly even their communication methods. In several clips, David observed Timothy participating in what appeared to be teaching sessions where the adult creatures demonstrated various survival techniques and forest navigation skills. The young man seemed to have adapted remarkably well to his new environment, showing none of the psychological trauma typically associated with prolonged captivity or isolation. Timothy's integration into the group was so complete that he had begun to adopt some of their behavioral patterns. He moved through the forest with the same silent grace as his adoptive family, communicated through a combination of gestures and vocalizations that the creatures seemed to understand, and participated in their daily routines of foraging, shelter maintenance, and group activities. David's analysis of the footage revealed even more disturbing details. The creatures appeared to have a sophisticated understanding of human technology and behavior. They had carefully preserved Timothy's electronic equipment, keeping it dry and protected in what appeared to be a specially constructed shelter. More remarkably, they seemed to understand the purpose of the cameras and recording devices, occasionally positioning them to capture specific activities or interactions. The social dynamics within the creature group were complex and fascinating. David observed clear hierarchies, with older individuals teaching younger ones and specific roles assigned to different members of the community. They demonstrated advanced problem-solving abilities, working together to construct elaborate shelters, create tools from natural materials, and even develop what appeared to be a primitive form of agriculture, cultivating certain plants and fungi in designated areas of their territory. The creatures' tool use was particularly sophisticated. They fashioned implements from stone, wood, and bone that served specific purposes: digging tools for extracting roots and tubers, cutting implements for processing plant materials, and even what appeared to be primitive weapons for hunting small game. The tools showed evidence of careful craftsmanship and were maintained and improved over time. David's military instincts told him that this discovery was too significant to handle alone. The footage he had captured would revolutionize our understanding of human evolution, primate intelligence, and the hidden ecosystems that still existed in North America's most remote wilderness areas. But he also understood that such evidence would attract attention from government agencies that might not have the public's best interests at heart. His concerns proved justified when David returned to civilization and attempted to contact Timothy's grandmother with news of his discovery. Within hours of uploading the footage to a secure server, David found himself under surveillance by unmarked vehicles and receiving visits from individuals who claimed to represent various federal agencies but carried credentials that didn't quite check out. The first visit came at 6:30 a.m., just 2 days after David had returned from the forest. 3 individuals in dark suits appeared at his office, claiming to represent a joint task force investigating unusual wildlife activity in national forests. Their leader, who identified himself only as Agent Morrison, was polite but firm in his questioning about David's activities in the Six Rivers National Forest. The visitors were professional and polite, but their message was clear. David had stumbled upon something that was considered a matter of national security. They explained that the existence of these creatures had been known to certain government agencies for decades, and that a careful protocol had been established to manage any interactions or discoveries. David's footage, they claimed, could disrupt delicate research programs and potentially endanger both the creatures and any humans who might encounter them. Agent Morrison revealed that the government had been aware of these creature populations since the 1960s. when military personnel conducting training exercises in remote wilderness areas began reporting encounters with unknown bipedal primates. Initial investigations had been conducted under the auspices of various classified programs, with findings that were deemed too sensitive for public release. The pressure to surrender his evidence intensified rapidly. David received offers to purchase his footage for substantial sums, followed by increasingly aggressive demands that he turn over all materials related to his investigation. When he refused, the harassment escalated to include break-ins at his office, tampering with his vehicle, and threats against his personal safety. The offers were substantial, initially starting at $500,000 for all footage and related materials, then escalating to over $2 million when David continued to refuse. The money was offered through intermediaries who claimed to represent private research foundations, but David's intelligence background allowed him to recognize the hallmarks of government-front organizations. David realized he was caught in a situation that went far beyond a simple missing person case. The government's reaction to his discovery suggested that authorities were already aware of these creatures' existence and were actively working to suppress any evidence that might reach the public. The implications were staggering. If Bigfoot was real and the government knew about it, how many other secrets were being kept from the American people? The harassment campaign against David was sophisticated and relentless. His phone calls were monitored, his internet activity was tracked, and his financial accounts were subjected to mysterious audits and freezes. Former military colleagues who had maintained contact with him suddenly became unavailable, and his professional network began to distance themselves from his work. The message was clear: cooperate with the suppression effort or face complete professional and personal destruction. David's bank accounts were frozen under the pretense of a tax investigation. His professional licenses were challenged by regulatory agencies, citing anonymous complaints. And his landlord received visits from individuals claiming to be conducting background checks for security clearances. The psychological pressure was intense and unrelenting, designed to isolate him from support systems and make resistance seem futile. But David's military training had prepared him for psychological warfare, and he refused to be intimidated. Instead, he began documenting the harassment he was experiencing, creating a parallel record of government suppression that was almost as compelling as his original Bigfoot footage. The pattern of intimidation and cover-up suggested that these creatures represented something far more significant than just an unknown species. They were evidence of a hidden world that powerful interests were determined to keep secret. Using skills learned during his military career, David began taking precautions to protect both himself and his evidence. He created multiple copies of his footage, stored them in secure locations, and established protocols for their release if anything happened to him. He also reached out to trusted contacts in the scientific community, sharing his findings with researchers who had the expertise to understand their significance. David's security protocols were based on techniques used to protect classified intelligence in hostile environments. He established dead drops in multiple locations, created encrypted digital copies stored on secure servers in different countries, and developed a network of trusted individuals who would release the information if he disappeared or was incapacitated. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a primatologist at UC Berkeley who had been quietly studying Bigfoot reports for over a decade, was among the first scientists to review David's footage. Her analysis confirmed what David had suspected. The creatures displayed behavioral patterns and physical characteristics that were consistent with a highly intelligent primate species that had somehow remained hidden from mainstream science. Dr. Rodriguez had been conducting her research in secret, knowing that open investigation of Bigfoot phenomena would destroy her academic career. She had accumulated a database of over 3,000 reported encounters, analyzed hundreds of footprint casts, and even collected hair and tissue samples that defied classification. David's footage provided the visual confirmation she had been seeking for years. The genetic analysis of hair samples that David had collected provided even more compelling evidence. The DNA showed characteristics that were clearly primate, but didn't match any known species in scientific databases. Most intriguingly, the genetic markers suggested a lineage that had diverged from human ancestors much more recently than previously thought possible. The DNA analysis revealed a genetic profile that was approximately 96% similar to modern humans, closer than chimpanzees or any other known primate species. The remaining 4% showed unique characteristics that suggested adaptation to specific environmental conditions and possibly enhanced physical capabilities. The genetic evidence supported the theory that these creatures represented a surviving branch of the human family tree. Dr. Rodriguez's preliminary findings indicated that these creatures might represent a surviving population of an archaic hominid species, possibly related to Homo erectus or an unknown branch of the human family tree. The implications for our understanding of human evolution were profound. If these beings had survived in North America for thousands of years, it would completely rewrite the story of human migration and development. The scientific analysis also revealed disturbing evidence of government knowledge and involvement. Several of the hair samples contained traces of synthetic compounds that suggested the creatures had been exposed to human-made chemicals, possibly through deliberate feeding or medical treatment. This evidence supported David's growing suspicion that government agencies had been studying and possibly managing these populations for decades. Chemical analysis revealed the presence of compounds used in veterinary tranquilizers, suggesting that the creatures had been captured and studied at some point. There were also traces of synthetic vitamins and minerals that indicated supplemental feeding programs. The evidence painted a picture of long-term government monitoring and management of these populations. As word of David's discovery began to spread through underground networks of researchers and cryptozoology enthusiasts, the pressure from government agencies intensified. David found himself the target of a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to discredit his findings and destroy his reputation. False stories about his military service appeared online. His professional licenses were challenged by regulatory agencies, and former clients were contacted and pressured to file complaints against him. The disinformation campaign was remarkably thorough and well coordinated. Fake social media accounts began spreading rumors about David's mental health and professional competence. Doctored documents appeared online, suggesting he had been discharged from the military under questionable circumstances. Even his family members were contacted by individuals claiming to be journalists or researchers, asking leading questions designed to elicit statements that could be used to undermine his credibility. Professional trolls flooded online forums with posts questioning David's military record, his investigative methods, and his mental stability. Fake reviews appeared on professional rating sites, describing fictional negative experiences with his services. The campaign was so sophisticated that it clearly required significant resources and coordination, further confirming David's suspicions about government involvement. The situation reached a crisis point when David received credible intelligence that a raid on his secure storage facilities was being planned. Realizing that his evidence was in immediate danger, he made the decision to release everything to the public through multiple channels simultaneously. The footage was uploaded to dozens of video platforms, sent to news organizations around the world, and distributed through encrypted networks that would make it impossible to suppress completely. David's release strategy was carefully planned and executed with military precision. He coordinated the simultaneous release across multiple time zones, ensuring that the footage would be available on dozens of platforms before authorities could react. He also included detailed documentation of the harassment campaign against him, creating a narrative that explained why the evidence was being suppressed. The public release of David's footage created an immediate sensation. Within hours, the videos had been viewed millions of times and were being analyzed by experts around the world. The quality and consistency of the evidence made it impossible to dismiss as a hoax, and the documentation of government suppression efforts added credibility to claims that authorities had been hiding the truth about Bigfoot for decades. The initial response was overwhelming. Major news networks picked up the story within hours, and social media platforms were flooded with discussions, analyses, and debates about the footage. The hashtag Bigfoot Revealed began trending worldwide, and the videos were shared millions of times across all platforms. The scientific community's response was divided but intense. Mainstream researchers who had previously dismissed Bigfoot as pseudoscience were forced to confront evidence that met rigorous standards of documentation and analysis. The footage showed anatomical details, behavioral patterns, and environmental interactions that would be nearly impossible to fabricate convincingly. Leading primatologists from around the world began requesting access to the raw footage for analysis. Dr. Jane Goodall, the renowned chimpanzee researcher, issued a statement calling for serious scientific investigation of the evidence. The International Union for Conservation of Nature announced the formation of a special committee to evaluate the footage and its implications for primate taxonomy. Most compelling was the documentation of Timothy Thornfield's apparent integration into the creature's social group. Anthropologists noted that his behavior in the footage suggested he had learned to communicate with the beings and had been accepted as a member of their community. The implications for our understanding of interspecies communication and intelligence were profound. The international response to David's revelations was swift and varied. European scientists, less constrained by American government pressure, began organizing expeditions to search for similar creatures in their own wilderness areas. Indigenous communities around the world came forward with their own stories and evidence of encounters with similar beings, suggesting that these creatures might represent a global phenomenon rather than a uniquely North American mystery. The Smithsonian Institution announced plans for a comprehensive analysis of the footage, while the National Geographic Society committed funding for follow-up expeditions to the area where David had made his discoveries. International research teams from Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom requested permission to conduct their own investigations in American wilderness areas. The government's response to the footage's release was swift and predictable. Official statements dismissed the evidence as elaborate hoaxes, while behind the scenes, agencies worked to discredit David and suppress further investigation. The area where he had made his discoveries was suddenly declared off-limits due to environmental concerns, and researchers who attempted to verify his findings were turned away by armed guards. The Forest Service issued emergency closure orders for large sections of the Six Rivers National Forest, citing concerns about endangered species habitat and fire danger. Military personnel were deployed to enforce the closures, and aircraft were prohibited from flying over the restricted areas. The response was so disproportionate that it only served to validate David's claims about government cover-up efforts. But the damage to the cover-up had already been done. David's footage had provided the world with undeniable evidence that intelligent bipedal creatures were living in North America's wilderness areas, and that government agencies had been aware of their existence for years. The revelation sparked a global conversation about what other secrets might be hidden from public view, and whether citizens had the right to know about discoveries that could fundamentally change our understanding of life on Earth. Timothy Thornfield's fate remained a mystery, as attempts to return to the area where he had been filmed were blocked by federal authorities. His grandmother, Margaret, filed lawsuits demanding access to her grandson and answers about his condition, but legal proceedings were stalled by claims of national security and public safety concerns. The legal battle that followed revealed the extent of government knowledge about these creatures. Court documents, heavily redacted but still revealing, showed that multiple agencies had been aware of Bigfoot populations for decades. Research programs, funded through black budgets and classified operations, had been studying the creature's behavior, intelligence, and potential impact on human society. Margaret Thornfield's legal team, led by prominent civil rights attorney Sarah Chen, filed Freedom of Information Act requests that uncovered decades of classified documents related to anomalous primate encounters in national forests. The The documents revealed a systematic program of evidence suppression and witness intimidation that had been ongoing since the 1960s. The classified documents revealed the existence of a joint military-civilian research program codenamed Project Wildman that had been studying these creatures for over 50 years. The program had documented hundreds of encounters, collected extensive biological samples, and even attempted limited communication with the beings. The research had been classified at the highest levels due to concerns about public panic and the potential impact on religious and scientific worldviews. David's life was forever changed by his discovery and the events that followed. He became a reluctant celebrity in the cryptozoology community while remaining a target of government harassment and surveillance. His private investigation business was destroyed by the controversy, but he found new purpose as an advocate for government transparency and the public's right to know about scientific discoveries. The harassment continued even after the footage's release, with David facing ongoing legal challenges, financial difficulties, and personal threats. However, he also received support from unexpected quarters, including former government officials who came forward to confirm the existence of classified programs studying these creatures. The footage that David captured in the forests of Northern California remains some of the most compelling evidence for Bigfoot's existence ever recorded. More importantly, it has opened a window into a hidden world that exists parallel to our own, challenging our assumptions about intelligence, consciousness, and humanity's place in the natural order. The creatures that David documented continue to live in the remote wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest, protected now not just by their own intelligence and stealth, but by government agencies that seem determined to keep their existence secret. The reasons for this secrecy remain unclear, but the implications are profound. If such remarkable beings can remain hidden in our modern world, what other wonders and mysteries await discovery in the wild places that still exist beyond the reach of civilization? The clip lasted 18 seconds. At first, it showed only static night vision grain, the faint hiss of wind, and a campfire's reflected glow across a plastic tarp. Then, from beyond the creek, a broad, upright shape crossed the frame. Its movements were slow and deliberate, partially obscured by drifting fog, before it turned and disappeared behind a ridge. A heartbeat later, the recording cut to black. Initial reactions were muted, but re-uploads began spreading across Reddit and YouTube within hours. A pattern soon formed in how people labeled the reposts, each one hinting at survival and encounter, rather than simple observation. By the next evening, thousands had watched the clip, yet Ellison himself could not be reached. The silence where his voice should have been grew louder with each unanswered call. Mark Ellison, 50, was a former fire tower ranger who spent 2 decades across the Olympic Peninsula. Known for his precision, he logged every route and weather shift, except, perhaps, the one that mattered most. He lived alone near Forks, where the forest pressed close to his property. After leaving his post, he ran a small channel focused on camping safety and wildlife behavior, field notes more than entertainment. He ignored the folklore around him, documenting only what could be measured. The device he used on his final trip was a compact infrared trail camera that automatically sent every recording to off-site storage. Early March 2024 brought steady rain to the upper Sol Duc drainage. Rain carried the smell of iron from wet bark. Mark Ellison had planned a 3-day trip to test a hybrid solar battery trail camera under dense canopy. He drove from his home in Forks and parked off Highway 101 near Fairholme before hiking in on foot. His plan was simple: set 2 cameras at separate clearings, then return once the data uploaded. Each note he recorded felt routine, until it didn't. GPS tracker and voice recordings showed a routine trip. He checked in at precise intervals, 3:12 p.m., noting barometric pressure, 5:40 p.m., mentioning drizzle. He reached camp before sunset, near a tributary of the Sol Duc River. On day 2, he moved between camera sites, covering nearly 5 miles before returning to camp by late afternoon. His last coordinates placed him a 1/4 mile from his tent. At 7:52 that evening, Ellison sent a voice note about rising wind and plans to leave early. The message uploaded, then the connection dropped. No further transmissions came after 8 p.m. At 8:41 p.m., his trail camera detected motion. It recorded 18 seconds of night vision footage before uploading to the cloud, the same clip showing a tall shape near the riverbank. Despite the valley's notoriously weak service, short bursts of connection often occurred along ridgelines, which could explain how the file transmitted successfully. Yet the file was perfect, too perfect. The successful upload confirmed equipment was functioning, yet nothing followed. The cameras stayed silent through the night. If the camera was alive, something else in the valley was too. When Ellison failed to return, his sister reported him overdue on March 14th. She had assumed he'd extended the trip because of persistent rain and poor road conditions, but after several unanswered messages, she contacted authorities. Search teams later found his vehicle locked at the trailhead. Teams advanced along the drainage using standard search grids. Near his camp, they found the tent intact, sleeping bag rolled, and cooking gear neatly stacked. His backpack rested under the tarp with one day's rations left. The radio was powered off, its batteries removed. Only his phone was missing. The charger remained coiled beside a full battery pack, suggesting he'd taken it with him before vanishing into the forest. A recovered set of boot impressions led away from camp for roughly 40 yards before blending into a patch of wet moss where tracking became unreliable. The path ran parallel to the stream in the same direction as the camera's recorded footage. Was he following something or being led? Searchers found no signs of struggle, no animal traces, and no evidence of sudden runoff or slope collapse. Technicians found Ellison's GPS trail ended abruptly at 8:02 p.m., less than 40 minutes before his camera recorded motion. Investigators blamed either drained batteries or a signal drop in rough terrain. His smartwatch kept transmitting 40 minutes longer, logging movement after the tracker went dark. 2 devices, 2 endpoints, no clear link. The footage drew attention only after his family shared his details online, connecting his name to the viral clip. Search teams expanded their radius but found nothing new. Rain erased traces. Only his gear and a field notebook remained. The last entry dated March 3rd, stopping mid-sentence, pen lifted mid-stroke. Frame-by-frame playback revealed more detail. The object's outline extended nearly 7 feet above ground level when scaled against visible branches. The infrared exposure, usually harsh on warm objects, registered the figure several degrees cooler than its surroundings. That single anomaly became the focus of countless breakdowns. Under normal conditions, a living subject moving through cold air would appear warmer on infrared. The inverse pattern suggested heavy insulation, either natural or layered, capable of masking body heat. But what kind of insulation makes something colder than the forest itself? Colorized conversions circulated across multiple forums, each exaggerating contrast in different ways. One enhanced frame showed a faint reflection on the lower left, 2 consecutive frames in which a smaller irregular shape appeared. Some called it a sensor echo or a lens reflection from fog droplets, while others saw the hint of another crouched figure. No one could agree on the scale, and no one could explain why it moved when nothing else did. Professionals with backgrounds in drone and wildlife imaging weighed in. A group of remote sensing students from Oregon State University attempted to reconstruct the camera's parameters based on the embedded EXIF metadata. Coordinates placed the scene on the south side of the Salt Duke River, roughly 2 miles from the nearest service road. Temperature metadata suggested ambient conditions near 43 degrees Fahrenheit, consistent with Ellison's earlier logs. The camera angle matched one of the test positions Ellison had described to fellow hobbyists weeks earlier. In a comment preserved through cached archives, he mentioned a spot overlooking a narrow stream bend with enough open ground to track deer movement. That detail aligned with the topography visible in the clip, a sloping bank descending into a shallow channel bordered by alder and cedar. He'd mapped it himself. He'd walked that ground before. So why did it look different through the lens? What puzzled analysts was the clean upload timestamp, The file's creation and transfer times showed no signs of delay or corruption. If the device had malfunctioned or been damaged, the upload would have stalled or produced a partial file. Instead, the connection remained steady for the full duration, meaning the camera completed its data queue without interruption. Perfect transmission from a valley known for dead zones. Technicians studying the pixel patterns noticed a faint flicker in the upper right quadrant between frames 241 and 245, less than a quarter of a second in real time. When brightness levels were equalized, a diffused light signature appeared, consistent with a brief reflection from a wet surface or metallic object. It moved counter to the camera's natural light gradient, suggesting an independent source of reflection rather than random interference. Something had caught light where no light should have been. Theories diverged. One camp claimed it was a visual echo from the moving figure. Another insisted it was the partial outline of a second body entering the periphery. A third argued for atmospheric distortion common in humid forest air when illuminated by infrared. No theory could fully explain why the reflected area appeared cooler than both background and subject, reversing expected thermal hierarchy. Independent field photographers recreated similar setups using identical hardware. Most achieved plausible silhouettes using heavy clothing or insulated suits, yet none could replicate the precise temperature inversion shown in the file. The simulated subjects always registered warmer than the forest floor, even when soaked or coated with mud. To match the readings, an object would need either a heat-reflective surface or extremely low core temperature inconsistent with a living human, or it would need to have been there so long it had become part of the cold itself. Satellite imagery confirmed that the area around the recorded coordinates contained deep canopy and water channels known for producing cold air pockets. In such zones, temperature gradients could shift abruptly over short distances. Analysts tried mapping air density changes to explain the flickering outlines, yet the footage's stability argued against wind interference. Every tree in the frame held still. Only the moving figure showed motion distortion, as if everything else knew to stay frozen. As online interest grew, various users claimed to possess clearer copies. Most were filtered versions of the same source, compressed and re-uploaded under misleading titles. The original remained on a cloud server associated with Ellison's account until it was mirrored by multiple websites. A retired wildlife biologist from the Pacific Northwest Research Station reviewed the clip at normal speed and noted proportion ratios unusual for any known animal. The limb length appeared human, but the forward pitch of the torso and restricted arm swing suggested limited shoulder rotation, a trait found in large quadrupeds when forced upright. Combined with the even pacing and apparent mass, the profile did not match typical human gait. It walked like something learning how. Forums filled with motion tracking overlays. Volunteers marked joint points and stride intervals. The results varied, but shared one oddity. The stride distance measured consistently longer than that of an average adult male. The figure's head never turned toward the camera, despite the obvious illumination shift when it crossed the clearing. It moved as if aware of the light source, but indifferent to it, or as if it had done this before. A few users highlighted the final 3 frames where the shape began to descend behind a slope. The camera registered a brief drop in ambient contrast, followed by a pulse of interference resembling static. Some mistook it for a system error, but file diagnostics confirmed intentional cutoff. The device terminated recording precisely at the standard 18-second mark, meaning the motion trigger had completed its cycle rather than failed. It ended exactly when it was supposed to. Nothing malfunctioned, nothing broke. It simply stopped watching. When investigators later cross-checked the metadata with official survey maps, the coordinates aligned with a ridge overlooking a narrow tributary of the Sol Duc River. The distance to the nearest access point measured just over 2 miles, accessible only by foot and far from campsites. Despite meticulous analysis, no consensus emerged. To some, the video showed a hoax performed with precision equipment. To others, it was a rare example of an unknown presence moving through one of the most isolated valleys in the region. The only certainty came from the data itself. The camera functioned exactly as designed, recorded at stable temperature and time, and transmitted the file without error. But certainty isn't the same as truth. By the second week after the leak, breakdown threads dominated discussion boards. Digital forensics groups produced papers describing possible causes, ranging from double exposure to sensor misread. Yet each hypothesis left one constant unexplained: the secondary reflection that appeared in those two brief frames. It was there, unmistakable, yet no one could say what it was or why it moved opposite the main subject. Some things defy focus no matter how many times you replay them. When search teams reached the coordinates tied to the footage, the clearing matched every contour visible in the clip: the slope, the stream bend, even the distinctive split trunk on the left side of the frame, all present. But the primary trail camera that had recorded the event was gone. Only its nylon mounting strap and a length of solar wire remained, both ends frayed but not cut. The ground beneath the tree showed no signs of struggle, only a compressed patch of soil where the camera housing should have rested. Something had taken it gently. 200 yards from the site, Ellison's backup camera remained active. It captured no visuals, only 8 seconds of heavy impacts, a low hum, then static at 8:42 p.m., 1 minute after the main clip. Analysts noted an electromagnetic-type spike, as if something nearby generated interference. His vehicle sat untouched at the Fairholme trailhead, keys gone but supplies intact. Hours after the footage spread, forensic users discovered a second save at 9:03 p.m., over 20 minutes after all devices went dark. Service in the valley was poor, yet deliberate access was clear. The file had been reopened. The question was, by whom? This discrepancy became the first tangible contradiction in the case. If Ellison had left camp before 8 p.m. and the footage auto-uploaded at 8:41, who interacted with the file at 9:03? Investigators tested the hypothesis of an automated server sync, but logs from the manufacturer's database showed no queued retries or firmware updates at that time. Whatever process modified the file had occurred locally, not through routine background operations. Further inspection revealed that the 9:03 record shared the same checksum as the original, ruling out content alteration. The change involved metadata only, consistent with a resave command triggered when a user previews or reopens the file, as if someone had been reviewing what they just recorded. That small gap, 22 minutes between upload and modification, became the focal point for both official investigators and online sleuths. Some analysts noted that minor server clock drift or timestamp desynchronization could technically account for the discrepancy, though the lack of corresponding network activity kept the anomaly under scrutiny. Searchers on the ground had found no footprints beyond the creek, no equipment suggesting Ellison retrieved the camera himself, and no evidence of wildlife interference capable of pressing buttons or powering devices. Yet the file's behavior implied human interaction, or something that understood how humans interact. Forums began speculating that someone else had been in the area, possibly another hiker or a passerby who found the camera and triggered a manual upload while checking its contents. But weather records showed heavy rain moving through the region that night, reducing visibility and making travel off established routes unlikely. Rangers also confirmed no other camping permits had been issued within a 5-mile radius during that period. No one else should have been there. So who touched the camera at 9:03? 3 nights after the original clip spread, a second version surfaced on a small video mirror under an unverified account. The username matched none of Ellison's, yet the description claimed it was a restored copy from the trail camera's SD card. Uploaded just after midnight on March 14th, between official searches and the final volunteer sweep, it seemed deliberately timed. The checksum differed slightly, indicating a new encode. This version ran 5 seconds longer. Amid static and interference, a faint shape appeared, elongated, bent, dragging something downslope. The feed ended in a smear of noise and blackout. 5 seconds that changed everything. Video forensic groups analyzed the new clip and found no edits, Only breaks typical of an interrupted upload resumed under weak signal. The file acted as if a frozen transfer had later continued from cached data, suggesting the added segment always existed but failed to send the first time. The camera had seen more than anyone realized. Its block-based system could store incomplete frames for later upload, yet no one could explain how those missing packets resurfaced 3 days later, or who held the physical card needed to retrieve them. By then, search teams had confirmed one fact: the primary camera was gone. Compression analysis deepened the puzzle. The static at the start of the added sequence displayed a symmetrical frequency band, evidence of re-encoding, not external noise. Experts described it as a signature left when damaged frames are rebuilt by automated correction software. The recovered images were cleaner than they should have been, almost too intact for a device that had supposedly gone offline. Someone had worked to restore them. But why? Viewers who enhanced the footage noticed a series of faint flickers along the right edge, forming a repeating pattern consistent with a swinging light source. When motion tracked, the rhythm aligned closely with a bipedal gait, alternating at just under 2 strides per second. The dragging form appeared attached or pulled, its heat signature fading unevenly as the larger shape moved downslope. Something was being carried or taken. Timing comparisons soon connected the recovered segment to another dataset, Ellison's smartwatch telemetry extracted from cloud backup. His device had been configured to sync periodically through a low-bandwidth satellite relay, preserving minute-level heart rate logs even after local signal loss. The data showed a sudden elevation at 8:44 p.m., climbing rapidly for less than 2 minutes before flatlining at 8:46. The moment of peak signal loss overlapped exactly with the extended portion of the new video. His heart had stopped at the exact moment the extra footage ended. To investigators, the correlation was circumstantial, but for online researchers, it became a turning point. The idea that the extra footage aligned with Ellison's last recorded heartbeat implied both events were captured within the same minute. The footage didn't just show what happened, it showed when he stopped running. Within 24 hours of its posting, the second file was removed from the original site for privacy concerns, but duplicates spread immediately across mirror channels. Each re-upload introduced new compression errors, yet the defining sequence, the faint figure dragging weight behind the ridge, remained visible enough to sustain argument. Whether it depicted corrupted pixels or something tangible, its timing and method of appearance transformed the case from an isolated disappearance into a digital mystery. The recovery team moved through the Sol Duke drainage with handheld thermal scanners, mapping every contour of the floodplain. On the 6th day, near a narrowing of the creek, they found an object half buried in mud beneath a fallen branch. It was Ellison's smartwatch, screen cracked, band torn, but GPS module intact. Data extracted from the watch showed a sudden burst of motion beginning at 8:43 p.m., with his heart rate spiking at 8:44 as he covered roughly 200 feet in under a minute before signals stopped. The elevation graph indicated a brief incline, then descent toward the water. Analysts estimated that he had covered the distance in less than 40 seconds before the signal flatlined. 40 seconds of speed, then nothing. Around the same area, investigators documented 2 sets of impressions in the soft soil. One matched standard hiking boots consistent with Ellison's model, size 11. The other appeared parallel, larger, broader, and bare. The second track measured nearly 14 inches from heel to toe, but the shape was uneven, with pressure points unlike a human arch. The prints extended for 3 paces before fading where the mud thinned near gravel. Wildlife biologists from the Department of Fish and Wildlife later examined plaster casts and noted that a bear could produce similar depth under rearing posture. But the stride length, over 5 feet, did not match known locomotion patterns. Biologists noted that while bears can rear briefly, sustained pacing at that stride length was improbable. The impressions showed neither a full quadrupedal gait nor a consistent upright stance, but something intermediate, something that walked beside him, matching him step for step. Despite growing speculation, Law enforcement issued no public statements. Search logs made no mention of recovering the missing SD card. Officially, the investigation categorized all unrecovered equipment as having undetermined disposition. By mid-March, the internet divided into factions. One group advanced what they called the human theory, the belief that Ellison's disappearance resulted from a staged scare gone wrong. They argued that another camper or filmmaker had planned a viral prank, misjudged conditions, and triggered a real emergency. But if it was staged, why did the footprints continue past the frame? Opposing them were proponents of the biological theory who treated the event as an authentic encounter with an unidentified species. They cited the temperature inversions in the original file and the stride spacing at the creek as evidence of a large biped adapted for stealth in cold environments. And no one could say who moved the file at 9:03. A third camp, labeled by moderators as the staged upload theory, took a different approach. They suggested that Ellison himself had captured legitimate wildlife footage, but someone else later manipulated or recontextualized it. The 9:03 p.m. modification, they claimed, marked an external actor accessing his account after the fact. These competing narratives generated a wave of open-source data projects. One group of independent analysts pulled IP logs from Mirror archives and discovered an address embedded in the header of the second upload. The IP traced not to Washington, but to a satellite modem registered in Idaho. When cross-referenced with commercial leasing databases, the modem's serial number appeared in a rental invoice issued to a forestry contractor operating in Olympic National Forest earlier that year. The company had returned the unit in January, weeks before Ellison's trip, a recycled connection from equipment that shouldn't have been active. But it was. That discovery reignited claims that someone with professional field access had handled the footage after his disappearance. Digital forensics experts reviewing the trail camera's communication protocol agreed that a remote connection could have initiated upload from any device paired to its cloud credentials. It was plausible, though improbable, that a technician testing residual logins from a recycled modem could have triggered a resync without knowing its content. Or someone knew exactly what they were looking for. While online debates deepened, a new development surfaced in late March. A regional newspaper received an anonymous message from someone claiming to possess unlisted footage from the same night. The sender described being a drone hobbyist testing night sensors several miles south of the Salt Duke drainage. Attached metadata placed the flight path within overlapping airspace at 8:44 p.m., 2 minutes before Ellison's smartwatch signal ended. When the outlet viewed the clip, it showed a faint thermal flare above the canopy, followed by a sudden cold patch moving diagonally through the frame. At 8:44, a new light cut across the canopy. Not bright, cold. There were no visible lights or reflective markers, no indication of human presence. Analysts who later examined screenshots described the object as elongated and vertical, emitting less heat than its surroundings, as if covered in moisture or dense material. A shape moved against the gradient, vertical, silent. The drone's coordinates intersected within roughly 150 feet of Ellison's final smartwatch GPS ping, accounting for expected GPS drift under dense canopy. Within a day of publication, the file vanished. The hosting site replaced the link with a message stating it had been removed for privacy violation. Attempts to verify ownership failed. The account used to upload the footage was deleted, and the original drone operator never came forward. The newspaper printed a brief correction stating that they could not confirm the clip's authenticity. Still, enough viewers had archived it to maintain discussion. The alignment of timestamps, trail camera at 8:41, drone at 8:44, smartwatch at 8:46, formed a triangular chronology that no one could dismiss. 3 devices, 3 timestamps, and nothing after. By early April, official search efforts concluded. Reports described weather degradation, reduced visibility, and low likelihood of recovery. Official reports later summarized 3 confirmed data points, each drawn from separate devices. The trail camera upload at 8:41 p.m., the smartwatch cessation at 8:46 p.m., and the drone telemetry anomaly logged at 8:44 p.m. Beyond those times, every trace ended. There were no confirmed sightings, no physical remains, and no identified suspects. Just silence where a man used to be. When spring arrived, the online focus shifted from search coordination to retrospective analysis. A few persistent archivists built composite maps linking every timestamp and coordinate into an interactive model. The overlap revealed a convergence zone less than 2 acres wide, dense forest floor bordered by drainage slopes, where line of sight dropped abruptly. It was the same valley Ellison had documented years earlier while mapping fire breaks. He'd walked that ground 100 times. But had something else been walking it longer? In June, another anomaly drew attention. Users tracking residual logins to Ellison's accounts noted new activity. Someone had accessed his long-abandoned video page from a masked IP routed through Oregon. The login session lasted less than 10 minutes, but resulted in deletion of all previous uploads except one titled Night Vision Test Number 2. Its upload timestamp predated the disappearance by exactly 2 minutes. Why leave only that one? The surviving clip, less than 10 seconds long, depicted a simple setup, Ellison adjusting the trail camera while testing focus. In the final frame, his reflection appeared faintly on the lens housing. Behind him, deeper in the trees, a dim outline curved across the periphery, slightly delayed in movement as though the reflection and the object behind it were out of sync. The detail went unnoticed for months until frame-stabilized copies circulated through forums. When slowed, the offset became clearer. Ellison's arm lowered first, but the faint silhouette of the same motion lingered a half-beat longer before fading, as if something had been learning how to mirror him and hadn't quite perfected the timing. Investigators declined to comment on the reactivation of his account. The provider confirmed only that the deletion and upload records were genuine and originated from correct credentials. Forensic analysts couldn't determine whether the login came from recovered hardware or a reused credential on another machine, leaving the source of access unresolved. Someone still had his passwords. Someone was still watching his work. By July, the case was formally suspended. The forest had taken everything back. Only the footage remained, clear, silent, watching. The 3 remaining points, the camera, drone, and watch, formed the last measurable chain in a story without closure. Local news moved on, and Moss reclaimed the search site. Online, only fragments survived, mirrored clips, conflicting diagrams, fading threads of speculation. The last trace of Mark Ellison came from a device built to record what passed before it, not what lingered behind. Everything after that was interpretation, pixels, reflections, and data gaps where a person should have been. Maybe something else had been watching him. On October 13, 2023, Emma Rodriguez had been in the Olympic National Forest for only 3 hours when she first heard the sound that would haunt her nightmares forever. The low, resonant call seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the ground beneath her feet and echoing from the trees themselves. She froze on the trail, her heart pounding as the sound repeated, too deep and too complex to be produced by any known animal, yet carrying an unmistakable intelligence that suggested communication rather than simple vocalization. The forest around her had fallen completely silent, as if every living creature was holding its breath in terror of what had just announced its presence. Emma's camera equipment began malfunctioning the moment she tried to record the strange vocalizations, her devices shutting down at seemingly random intervals, despite having functioned perfectly just minutes before. Her GPS readings showed impossible coordinates that placed her in locations that didn't exist on any map, while her compass spun wildly as if something was actively interfering with her technology. The silence that followed the creature's call was so complete, it seemed to press against her eardrums like a living thing, broken only by the sound of her own panicked breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath her trembling feet. But beneath that silence, Emma began to detect something else, the almost imperceptible sound of something massive moving through the undergrowth with impossible stealth. When Emma finally worked up the courage to continue down the trail, she discovered massive footprints pressed deep into the soft earth. Prints that measured nearly 18 inches in length and showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs. The tracks formed a deliberate pattern around the area where she'd been standing, as if something had been circling her position while she remained frozen in terror. Most disturbing was the realization that whatever had made these prints had approached to within mere feet of where she stood, close enough to touch her. Yet she had never seen or heard its approach through the dense undergrowth. The depth of the impression suggested something that weighed over 600 pounds, moving with a grace that defied its massive size. Emma's attempts to leave the area were immediately frustrated by obstacles that seemed too coordinated to be coincidental. Fallen trees blocked the trail she'd used to enter the forest, positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural occurrence. Her satellite phone produced only static and interference that seemed to intensify whenever she tried to call for help, as if something was actively jamming her communications to prevent her from sharing her discoveries with the outside world. The isolation that had seemed appealing when she'd planned this expedition now felt like a trap, with Emma beginning to realize that she was no longer the observer in this situation, but rather the observed. Every step she took seemed to be anticipated, every route she chose blocked by obstacles that appeared too convenient to be natural. The first direct sighting came as Emma struggled to find an alternate route through the dense forest, her panic growing with each blocked path and dead end. Through the trees ahead, she caught a glimpse of something enormous, moving between the massive trunks with impossible stealth, a figure that stood upright like a human, but possessed proportions that suggested a creature of incredible size and strength. The being seemed to be studying her from a distance, its movements coordinated and purposeful as it paralleled her desperate attempts to escape. When Emma tried to focus her camera on the creature, the device immediately shut down, leaving her with only the terrifying memory of eyes that reflected the filtered sunlight with unmistakable intelligence, and what appeared to be curiosity about her presence in its domain. Emma's terror escalated when she realized that the creature was not alone. Sounds of movement from multiple directions indicated that she was surrounded by several large beings that were coordinating their activities with a precision that suggested advanced communication abilities. The forest itself seemed to be working against her escape, with branches that caught at her clothing in ways that seemed too deliberate to be accidental, and roots that appeared to shift position to trip her at crucial moments. Her attempts to document what was happening were frustrated by equipment failures that occurred at the most crucial moments, as if whatever was watching her understood the importance of preventing her from gathering evidence of their existence. The creatures seemed to possess an understanding of human technology that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. Emma's frantic escape became a blur of terror as the forest closed in around her. The deeper she ran, the more the landscape twisted. Paths vanished, landmarks shifted, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and something musky. Every time she paused, she could hear the creatures moving just out of sight, their footfalls muffled, guttural calls echoing like a language meant for the trees. At one point, Emma tumbled down a slope into a shallow creek. The water was icy, shocking her back to her senses. She scrambled up, only to see a massive shadow pass silently along the ridge above. The creature paused, its silhouette framed by moonlight, and Emma felt its gaze settle on her like a physical weight. She pressed herself against the bank, barely daring to breathe, as the being let out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through her bones. The chase resumed, but now the creatures were driving her, not just following, but steering her with uncanny precision. Whenever she tried to double back or hide, a branch would snap or a stone would be thrown, forcing her to change direction. She caught glimpses of more than one figure moving in parallel, their eyes glinting in the darkness, their movements impossibly fast and coordinated. Emma realized with dread that she was being herded toward a destination she could neither see nor understand. Suddenly, the forest opened into a wide, unnatural clearing. The ground was covered in spirals of stones and bones, and the trees around the perimeter were marked with deep gouges and strange symbols. The air was thick with anticipation, and Emma felt as if she had stepped into the center of some ancient ritual. The largest creature emerged from the shadows, standing at the edge of the clearing, its breath steaming in the cold night air. It raised its arms and let out a series of calls, each one answered by the others in a chorus that made the ground tremble. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing. Was this a warning? A test? The creatures circled the clearing, their eyes never leaving her, their movements deliberate and measured. For a moment, time seemed to stretch and warp, the world narrowing to the circle of stones and the silent, watching eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ritual ended. The creatures melted back into the forest, leaving Emma alone and trembling in the center of the clearing. She didn't wait to see if they would return. Driven by a surge of adrenaline, Emma fled into the darkness. The memory of the ritual burned into her mind. Even as she ran, she knew the forest was still watching, and that whatever had happened in that clearing was only a glimpse of a mystery that would never let her go. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance began to manifest in ways that Emma struggled to understand or control. She found herself anticipating the movements of her unseen watchers, adjusting her path to avoid areas where she sensed their presence, while simultaneously being herded along routes that led deeper into their territory. The creatures seemed to be learning from their observations of her behavior, adapting their tactics based on her responses, and becoming more sophisticated in their approach with each passing hour. Emma began to feel like a laboratory animal being studied by researchers whose intelligence far exceeded her own, trapped in an experiment whose purpose she couldn't begin to understand. The realization that she was being manipulated by something that could think and plan was more terrifying than simple predation. The most direct encounter came when Emma stumbled into a small clearing and found herself face to face with the massive creature that had been stalking her through the forest. The being stood over 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to shimmer with an almost metallic quality in the filtered sunlight, with eyes that held an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. It studied her with the same intensity that she had been trying to use to study the forest, tilting its massive head as if trying to understand what kind of creature she was and what her intentions might be. The moment of eye contact lasted only seconds, but it left Emma with the chilling realization that she was being evaluated according to criteria she couldn't comprehend. The creature's expression seemed almost curious, as if it was encountering something as unusual to it as it was to her. Emma's attempt to slowly back away from the creature was met with a low vocalization that seemed to carry meaning, as if the being was trying to communicate something important or warn her about something she couldn't see. The sound was complex, with tonal variations that suggested it was part of a sophisticated language system, and Emma had the disturbing realization that the creature was actually trying to talk to her. When she continued to retreat, the creature's vocalizations became more insistent, and she could hear answering calls from the forest around her as other beings responded to what sounded like tactical coordination. The realization that she was surrounded by multiple intelligent creatures that were discussing her fate in a language she couldn't understand filled Emma with a terror that transcended anything she had ever experienced. The decision to run came when Emma heard the creatures beginning to move closer, their massive forms crashing through the underbrush with increasing boldness as they closed the distance between themselves and their subject. She turned and sprinted toward what she hoped was the direction of the main trail, her flight through the dark forest becoming a nightmare of stumbling over unseen obstacles and constantly looking over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. The creature's response was immediate and coordinated, with sounds of movement that indicated they were not willing to let their subject escape without a significant effort to recapture her. Their pursuit began with what sounded almost like disappointment, as if they had hoped for a different outcome from their attempted communication. The chase through the forest revealed the true extent of the creature's physical capabilities as they moved through the dense woodland with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for beings of their size. Emma could hear them crashing through the trees behind her, their pursuit coordinated in ways that suggested they were working together to cut off her escape routes and funnel her toward a destination of their choosing. The sounds of their movement indicated that they were not simply chasing her, but were actively herding her, using their superior knowledge of the terrain to guide her flight along paths that would eventually lead her back into their control. Their footsteps thundered through the forest with a rhythm that suggested they were matching each other's pace, working as a coordinated unit rather than individual predators. During her desperate flight, Emma began to notice that the very forest seemed to be conspiring with her pursuers, creating obstacles that slowed her progress while providing clear pathways for the creatures that hunted her through the darkness. Branches caught at her clothing with deliberate precision. Roots shifted to trip her at crucial moments, and the terrain itself seemed to funnel her toward areas where her pursuers could more easily corner her. Most disturbing was the growing realization that the sounds of pursuit were becoming more organized and strategic, with different voices calling to each other in what sounded like tactical coordination. The creatures were communicating constantly during the chase, sharing information about her location and coordinating their movements with military precision. As Emma stumbled through the undergrowth, her panic-stricken mind began to process details that her terror had initially obscured, fragments of understanding that painted an even more disturbing picture of her situation. The creatures pursuing her seemed to be using tools. She could hear the distinctive sounds of implements striking wood and stone, suggesting they possessed technology that no wild animal should have been able to create or use. Their vocalizations carried nuances that indicated not just communication, but complex language, with tonal variations that suggested they were discussing strategy and coordinating their efforts with a sophistication that rivaled human military operations. The realization that she was being hunted by something that could think, plan, and use tools was more terrifying than any simple animal attack. The forest around Emma began to take on an increasingly surreal quality as her flight continued, with shadows that moved independently of any visible source and sounds that seemed to come from directions that defied the laws of physics. She found herself running through areas that her rational mind insisted couldn't exist. Clearings that were perfectly circular despite being surrounded by ancient trees, streams that flowed uphill, and rock formations that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. The pursuit behind her continued relentlessly, accompanied by phenomena that suggested the very fabric of reality was being manipulated by forces beyond her comprehension. The creatures seemed to possess abilities that went beyond simple physical prowess, as if they could influence the environment itself to aid in their hunt. Emma's terror reached new heights when she realized that her pursuers seemed to be enjoying the chase, their calls carrying what could only be described as amusement, as if her panic was providing them with entertainment rather than simply serving a practical purpose. The creatures appeared to be toying with her, allowing her to think she was escaping only to cut off her route and force her to change direction. Their superior knowledge of the terrain gave them an overwhelming advantage, and Emma began to understand that her flight was nothing more than another part of their experiment, a test of her responses under extreme stress rather than a genuine opportunity for freedom. The psychological warfare was as deliberate as their physical pursuit, designed to break down her resistance and force her into complete submission. At one point during the chase, Emma managed to climb a massive fallen tree that had created a natural bridge across a deep ravine, hoping to put some distance between herself and her pursuers. But as she reached the middle of the makeshift bridge, she heard the unmistakable sound of the creatures climbing up behind her with impossible agility. Their massive hands gripped the bark with ease, their powerful limbs propelling them up the trunk with a speed that defied their enormous size. Emma could hear their breathing growing closer, deep and rhythmic, like the sound of massive bellows. And she realized with growing horror that they were actually gaining on her, despite her head start. The creature's pursuit took on an almost playful quality, as they began to demonstrate abilities that seemed designed to showcase their superiority over their human prey. Emma watched in terror as one of the beings leaped from tree to tree with impossible grace, covering distances that should have been fatal for any creature of its size. Another seemed to be moving through the forest canopy above her, keeping pace with her desperate flight while remaining almost completely invisible among the dense foliage. The coordination between the creatures was so precise that Emma began to suspect they were communicating through methods she couldn't detect, perhaps using infrasonic frequencies or other signals that were beyond human perception. As Emma's energy waned, she stumbled into a clearing she didn't recognize, one that seemed impossibly ancient, the ground covered in spirals of stones and bones. The air was thick with the scent of moss and something musky, and the trees pressed in so tightly that the sky was only a memory. The creatures paused at the edge, watching her with a patience that felt almost ritualistic. For a moment, Emma felt as if she were the centerpiece of a ceremony, the subject of a gathering that had been waiting for her arrival for centuries. The largest of the beings stepped forward, raising its arms and letting out a guttural call that echoed through the trees, answered by the others in a chorus that made the ground vibrate beneath her feet. Suddenly, the spell was broken. The creatures turned and melted back into the forest, leaving Emma alone in the clearing. She didn't know if she had passed some kind of test or if they had simply lost interest, but she seized the opportunity to run. Branches whipped at her face and roots threatened to trip her with every step, but she pushed on, driven by a primal fear that drowned out all rational thought. Behind her, she could still hear the creatures moving, their calls growing fainter as she put distance between them. But even as she escaped, Emma knew the forest was still watching, and that whatever had happened in that clearing was only the beginning of a mystery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The breakthrough that would save Emma's life came when she stumbled into an area where her cell phone unexpectedly picked up a weak signal, allowing her to place a frantic call to emergency services while still running from her pursuers. The 911 recording captured her panicked description of being chased by creatures that defied rational explanation, beings that moved through the forest with intelligence and coordination that suggested advanced cognitive abilities. Her call was interrupted by sounds that the emergency operator later described as unlike anything in their experience. Vocalizations that seemed to come from multiple sources and carried an unmistakable sense of intelligence and purpose. The creatures seemed to realize what she was doing and began calling to each other with increased urgency, as if debating whether to stop her communication or allow it to continue. Emma's call ended abruptly when her phone lost signal, but not before emergency responders had obtained her GPS coordinates and a recording that would become the subject of intense analysis and debate. The creatures pursuing her seemed to realize that outside help was coming, and their vocalizations took on a different quality, less playful and more urgent, as if they were debating whether to continue their pursuit or retreat deeper into the forest. Emma could hear them calling to each other in what sounded like rapid consultation, their massive forms still crashing through the trees behind her, but with less coordination than before. The change in their behavior suggested that they understood the implications of human authorities becoming involved in their activities. The sound of approaching helicopters seemed to trigger a fundamental change in the creatures' behavior, their pursuit becoming less aggressive as they apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Emma could still hear them moving through the forest around her, but they were no longer actively hurting her or trying to cut off her escape routes. Instead, they seemed to be withdrawing deeper into the wilderness, their vocalizations fading as they put distance between themselves and the approaching rescue operation. Emma's relief was tempered by the realization that her ordeal was far from over. She was still lost in a vast wilderness with creatures that could return at any moment if they decided the threat had passed. The creatures' withdrawal was not immediate or complete, as Emma continued to hear them moving through the forest around her for several more hours. They seemed to be maintaining surveillance of her position while staying far enough away to avoid detection by the search teams. Their vocalizations became more subdued but never stopped entirely, suggesting that they were continuing to communicate about her presence and the arrival of outside help. Emma had the disturbing realization that she was still being watched and evaluated, even as rescue teams worked to locate her position. The creature's ability to remain hidden while maintaining awareness of the situation demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that was deeply unsettling. As the search helicopters grew closer, Emma began to notice changes in the forest around her that suggested the creatures were actively working to conceal evidence of their presence. Footprints that had been clearly visible just hours before seemed to be disappearing, as if someone was deliberately obscuring the tracks. Equipment that had been scattered during her flight was being moved or hidden, and the paths through the forest that had seemed so clear during the chase were becoming increasingly difficult to follow. The creatures appeared to be conducting a systematic cleanup operation, removing any evidence that might confirm Emma's incredible story about what had happened in the wilderness. The search and rescue operation that followed Emma's emergency call revealed evidence that supported her incredible claims while raising new questions about what had actually occurred in those remote mountains. Rangers found massive footprints throughout the area where Emma had been chased, tracks that formed complex patterns suggesting coordinated movement by multiple large beings. Her camera equipment was discovered scattered throughout the forest, positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than random dropping, with memory cards that contained hours of footage showing glimpses of enormous figures moving through the trees with obvious intelligence and purpose. The equipment had been handled with care, as if the creatures understood its value and had deliberately preserved it for discovery. The footage recovered from Emma's cameras provided the most compelling evidence ever captured of intelligent non-human life in North American forests, showing clear images of bipedal creatures that stood over 8 feet tall and moved with coordination that indicated advanced cognitive abilities. The beings appeared to be deliberately positioning themselves to be recorded, as if they wanted their existence to be documented, but only under circumstances of their own choosing. Most remarkably, some sequences showed the creatures using what appeared to be primitive tools and communicating with each other through complex vocalizations that suggested a sophisticated language system. The footage also captured moments where the creatures seemed to be studying Emma's equipment with obvious scientific interest, manipulating her devices with a dexterity that suggested hands capable of fine motor control. Analysis of the recovered footage revealed details that investigators found deeply unsettling, particularly the way the creatures seemed to be conducting their own documentation of Emma's behavior and responses. Several sequences showed the beings using what appeared to be primitive recording devices of their own, crude but functional tools that suggested they were gathering their own evidence of the encounter for purposes that remained completely mysterious. The creatures' behavior indicated not just intelligence, but also scientific curiosity, as if they were conducting their own research project with Emma as the unwilling subject. Most disturbing was the discovery that some of the footage had been edited or altered in ways that suggested the creatures possessed technical knowledge that exceeded what should have been possible for beings living in the wilderness. Emma was found 12 hours after her emergency call, discovered by search teams following the trail of broken vegetation and scattered equipment that marked her desperate flight through the forest. She was dehydrated and exhausted, but physically unharmed, though her mental state suggested she had experienced trauma that went far beyond simple fear of wild animals. Her account of being chased by multiple intelligent creatures was initially met with skepticism, but the physical evidence and recorded footage forced investigators to take her claims seriously. Most puzzling was her insistence that the creatures had deliberately allowed her to escape once they realized that outside help was coming, suggesting that their intelligence extended to understanding the broader implications of their actions. The evidence left behind after Emma's escape, strange tool marks, massive coordinated footprints, and her haunting footage, forced even the most skeptical rangers to admit she had encountered something far beyond a wild animal. The area was quietly restricted, and rumors spread of a hidden society in the forest. But Emma's story remained the only first-hand account. Her experience stands as a chilling warning. Some mysteries in the wild are not meant to be solved, and the silence of the forest may be watching, waiting for the next intruder.